Welcome to the Attleboro Area Industrial Museum. This is our contribution to the big read this year. I'm featuring the case we have out here, which I call the Wampanoag Artifacts and Replicas case. It's been there for a lot of years, 1988, I believe. And it shows the tools used by the Wampanoag tribe to hunt, prepare food, build structures, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about two other places that honored Native traditions here in Attleboro, the Bronson Museum and the Wandering Bull. And of course, this is an NEA Big Read program. It's sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. And it just encourages people to read and participate in terms of diverse groups of folks. So grab a book. I've got plenty. It is good reading. So I thought Honoring, which is a poem in here on page 68, kind of talks about the traditions here. So here we go. There's the case. And it turns out, thank you, Leanne, my assistant, for taking all these great pictures. I butchered them when I put them in the PowerPoint, so this is out towards the front of the museum near our guest book. And it's in the original old case. It's an antique. So what we have here is about 9,000 years ago, the first inhabitants of Attleboro were learning and practicing their craft using materials from the land. So they used stones and wood and parts of animals. They used clay to make, that's a clay pot piece. They used those to build the tools for their existence. So the Wampanoag Artifacts and Replica case shows those tools and the products that they made, that they used to make their homes, to hunt for, and help them prepare their food. So these kind of here are the tool making part, and these are the products up here: projectile points, scrapers, knives. This is a bear claw necklace that was an extra piece. So it really doesn't have anything to do with the Wampanoag as far as I know. This is a large hoe there. It's very dark. It's a piece of slate. That's a piece of a bowl, clay bowl. But that, I think, is the most impressive one. It's a quarrying stone, so it's very heavy, and they'd use it to break off pieces of stone, different stone, and they would make and build with. This is about the Richardsons, who this piece came from. This is 37 sites here in Attleboro that have been explored by the Richardsons, and this is a picture of one of the dioramas that was at the Robbins Museum. We'll hear about that later. A little close up, you get to see, you can see that this is an axe head. This is another axe head that has grooves that would be attached. This a hoe. This is a chipping stone. They'd use it to chip out pieces here on these smaller projectile points. A knife, a scraper, another projectile point, a sharpening stone, a piece of slate, I think another knife or scraper. Most of the stone is called felsite. It is an igneous rock, kind of hard. The clay and things like that were much softer and probably came right out of the riverbed. So that tells you a little bit about Attleboro's first craftspeople. They came from an age which I'm not going to butcher, but it was about 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. By the time the English came, most of them were gone. They had a plague. They think that was spread by a shipwrecked sailor who was going to Jamestown and got off course, and the Indians saved him, and then they got him some disease or something that he had. They were not used to that kind of thing because they had not been around Europeans. Most of the things we have in our collection, pretty much all of it, except for the bear cloud necklace, were from the Richardson collection. So John A. Richardson and his brother Charles were residents of Attleboro during the 1890s and 1900s. They searched plowed farm fields and backyard gardens. Most of their finds were surface finds. That means they were less than a foot down into the dirt. They had plowed or dug up, and they had come up to the surface when somebody plowed or dug up. Most of the finds had great names. They identified the 37 sites with names like City Line, Mutlow's Garden, Horton's Rye Field, Brownell's Backyard, and C.O.'s Sweet Garden. That's just a few. And the Mass Archaeological Society said, please don't tell folks where these are. You know, you don't want to share that because then people might go digging around in somebody's private property. So I don't know where they are. So our collection basically shows the tools of the Wampanoags and what they used. This is an example of a diorama that was it's at the Bronson Museum. This is all painting, and these are miniatures that were made. This is a Wee-2, you know, the huts that they lived in. They used young saplings, they bent them over, lashed them together, and then they would cover them with either grasses or bark. So they were pretty sturdy. There was one I saw at the Attleboro Museum in Bristol, Rhode Island, and it had a seating arrangement on it, had a central fire. It was pretty spacious. You could get 5 people in there fairly comfortably. So that was supposedly, according to the caption, it says this could be what North Main Street and County looked like at 69 AD. I just can't get my head around it. So the collection we have were our axe heads, chisels, wedges, knives. They're all used to work the wood and stone to create numerous projectile points from various rocks and minerals. They created the scrapers for use in tanning and finishing skins and hides. And they use those hides to make clothing and bags and pouches and door coverings like this. You know, they would put a hide over the door and it would keep the weather out. And according to what I read, they only use these in the spring. I would think they might use them in the winter, but I guess they wintered on the water. I'm not sure exactly what the history of that is. That will be part 2. That's just basically a blow-up of the artifacts that were bought and housed at the Bronson Museum from the Richardson collection, and they called him Indian Jack Richardson, a very appropriate name. He lived on Hope Street, and basically he and his brother rambled around Attleboro area for almost 40 years finding different materials and artifacts, and collected up to 20,000. The knives were fashioned out of something called felsite, which is a hard igneous rock, and they would be used to prepare food or cut hides or vines that the Wampanoag used in their daily life. That large hoe up here, once they had planted corn, they would use those to do their fields. The exhibit is repeated a lot of times in the museum. And this was how the Native Americans did their work, but when you look at the jewelry making exhibit and the exhibit from the button making in textiles, it all kind of repeats that tools and products. So this fits so well into the theme of our museum. I was kind of surprised, to be honest with you. Most of the information I got here came from Maurice Robbins' book right there. It's The Indian History of Attleboro. That's a blown up version we have. Robbins worked at the Attleboro Steam and Electric Company, which was the mother company of Mass Electric, which is not Mass Electric now. What is it? Yeah. So it's now National Grid, but he was a technician and a worker there for 40 years. But he had a love of archaeology. He was a founding member of the Mass Archaeological Society. He took courses at Brown. He took correspondence courses from the University of Chicago, Dr. Maurice Robbins did, and got his doctoral in the philosophy from the McKinley Roosevelt Institute in Chicago. He was born in 1899. He died in 1990. Lived on Steer Street. He wrote probably 200 articles and studies, archaeological studies and summaries. But perhaps the most famous or valuable book he wrote was the Amateur Archaeologist's Handbook. And it's still in print. You can get it, it's paperback. I intend on buying it for the museum, so we have one here. And I don't think you can say enough about who he was and what he did. And let's get to him, actually. So the photos, again, thank you to my assistant, Leanne, who did great photos, and I butchered them to get into the program, but that's okay. This is Dr. Maurice Robbins. I went to the current Robbins Museum, which is where the Bronson Museum got moved to, and two gentlemen there helped me immensely, along with a woman named Suanna, who was a former director, president of the Mass Archaeological Society. And they gave me some great information. So the Bronson Building was the third location of the Mass Archaeological Society. First it was at the courthouse from 39 to 41, then to Capron Park at the museum. It shared the Capron Park casino area with the Attleboro Arts Museum and a historical museum. So it got a little crowded, and then Dr. Robbins persuaded some businessmen to purchase the Richardson collection, which was 20,000 artifacts. And then one businessman who was part of the purchasing group knew of a floor of the Bronson Building, which had just been built, I guess, in early 1900s. It wasn't just built, and it was empty. Dr. John Bronson had a house on the corner of North Main Street and County Street, and then they built this modern building where his house was. He was the city doctor at the time. Everybody who was born probably had Dr. Bronson back turn of the century. In the photos you're going to see, that's his house, and I think you're looking at North Main here and County going this way, and probably South Main's coming away this way. And I guess he has this great garden in the back. You can see a little, looks like a trellis or a crepe arbor there. And that unfortunately was taken away. And from our postcard collection, you can see the new building right here. And that's the future home of the Bronson Museum. And there's a few mobiles here, so automobiles. So I'm thinking this is probably 20s, 1920s. Another postcard. This actually has a message on it. It says, "I'm waiting for a letter from Dad, and I hope you guys are all fine." So I don't know who this came from. It was one of our postcard collections, and this is an actual photo of the Bronson Museum around the same time, maybe a little later, maybe the 30s, but pretty interesting. Kind of old, kind of weathered. So the Bronson Museum was maintained by the Mass Archaeological Society from 43 to 1987. It had an office there. Doc Robbins was the curator and I think at the time an officer of the Mass Archaeological Society. Had a lecture hall for meetings. It had other event space. It had a workroom where they could go and do their work. It had a library for members. Dr. Robbins was the director as well as one of the founding members of the society. So the Bronson Building was being sold, and in 1987 they were asked to move. I think it was less than 60 days that they had to move out. So they looked for a place, and where did they find this place? We had empty space here at this museum, and a lot of the material were moved here and put in storage. And then it moved to 17 Jackson Street in Middleborough, and that's where the Bronson Museum is now, and it was renamed the Maurice Robbins Museum of Archaeology. I think it was in 1990, 91. So it took them a while to get everything together, but if you haven't been there, you should go. Saturday, 10 to 2, it's open, it's a big space. But I took some pictures when I went, so the dioramas and some of the pictures I'm showing you were from my visit. Vic Mastone and Greg Lott. Greg Lott was here, I think, for the Historical Preservation Society. And they helped me immeasurably. So they gave me permission to use the slides and pictures. They're open Saturdays, 10 to 2. They got a lot of neat things there. So first diorama. I guess because they had 20,000 artifacts, they weren't going to just lay artifacts all over the place. So what they did was Dr. Robbins thought it would be great to have them the artifacts engaged in dioramas. I honestly am having a hard time figuring out what this is. I think it's a seashore in one of their summer areas. The quality of the photos weren't that great, so bear with me. This was a diorama, and I think this gentleman here is doing this. Native American is quarrying, because it looks like he's got a large quarry stone, and he's breaking off some stone here. There's a lot of stone here. So again, the background was painted, and then here had some of the things that, some of the artifacts that they acquired. The painter was the same guy for all of the information, and you'll see his name on a lot of the paintings there. I'm not sure who, I had his name on the tip of my tongue for a while, and then now, whew, it's gone. Another diorama, one of the 6 dioramas. This is, I think, that same small picture we saw before. It's an encampment. You can see that they're doing some tanning of hides here. They have the weed-toos here and here. And I think that's a longhouse there. So it would be for larger groups. Again, by the river, that's where most tribes would settle, because it was sources of food and drinking water and things to that effect. The Bronson Museum had these great, this is the way they laid out their artifacts. So they would show you the projectiles in one section, and then the different axe heads and things like that. They would show you digging tools that would be strapped on. And then another diorama would be them tools that they would be used with stone sticks or some kind of attachment. So again, you have some of them hanging on the back of the display, and then some in the front. So that was basically what the Bronson Museum looked like until 1988, 87. I went many times, was told many times to keep my hands in my pockets, because these were dioramas, and you wanted to touch these little people there, But Dr. Robbins was very diligent, and so was my mother. So this is the Robbins Museum in Legg in Middleborough. So this is the archaic village, which had been partially displayed in Attleboro, and you can see again the village is in the front. This was called the Wampanoag site in Middleborough about 10,000 years ago. Supposedly it was found, and some interesting things they did. They used a multiple pole construction, which allowed for heavier weight reeds and bark to be put on top of the structures. And this is what they said. I think basically the village was probably only occupied in the spring, but they would come back to it year after year after year. So this is the diorama they have there at the Robbins Museum. That's a close-up. I mean, this is behind glass, so it's really pretty interesting to take a look at how things were done. Again, the green is painted on. That's one of the larger longhouses with the multiple pole construction. Again, I would say it's by the ocean, but I'm not sure. The drying racks they would use, so I think it was as they were fishing. And this is my pitch to go to the Robbins Museum. So again, thanks to Greg and Vic for helping me out. If you go to Robbins Archaeology Museum or Mass Associated Archaeological Society, you'll be able to see, you can go to the website. It's great stuff there. And again, a lot of good things to look at and resources, and they were real accommodating if you need things. And now it brings me to the Wandering Bull. So this is Paul Bullock. Now, Paul Bullock was born in Bristol, Rhode Island. He was a Wampanoag. And at the time, the Wampanoags were not a federally recognized tribe. He grew up knowing about his heritage, and he learned a lot about Native American crafts and Boy Scouts, and he got hooked. And the powwow circuit was not very prominent at the time. So Paul, when he was old enough, and I got all my information basically from his sons, Chris and Andy. I did phone interviews with them, and they told me that when their dad Paul was old enough, he would go to New York City because there was a large contingency of Iroquois, Native American there, and Mohawk, and they were the walkers, the steel walkers. So they were building the skyscrapers. And on the weekends, they would have community. They would have a powwow or a ceremony. So he would go down there and be like a sponge, absorb everything he could, come back up. He was a Marine veteran, and once he completed his tour and of service, he returned to the area, and he continued his love of him being a Native American. And he married Harriet, his wife. They had 6 children, and he wanted to bring them up honoring his Native American tradition. So here he is in full regalia. I think looks like it might be a scout meeting. I don't know. Looks like a church basement. Yeah, I could be. I would thought maybe St. Teresa's, St. Joseph's, someplace like that. They have a house, I think, on Union Street still. The Bullocks do. So what Paul and Andy told me was that, or what Andy and Chris, the sons of Paul, told me, was that they would pile into the VW bus with the 6 kids and the dancing bustles, and they would go to a powwow, wherever it was in New England. And they would gather stuff. And most of the stuff they gathered was information. So they were, again, sponges for stories. And Andy Bullock, who is now the executive director of the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum in New Hampshire, said that there wasn't a lot of stuff around. So his dad would just dive into it. He taught them how to dance. They learned from the different tribes that were there how to dance, how to make regalia. And as Chris once said to me, they got regalia-itis. So everything they saw they wanted to make, the leggings and the headdresses and the feather vests and things like that, all the different crafts that they could see going on there. And they said they would listen to the seasoned tribe members and they would hear their stories and learn their craft. He said the Wandering Bull started as an idea in their basement on a folding table with all the things they had accumulated. And when somebody wanted something, they would come to their house and they would end up being there. So that's how it worked. So all during the 60s, that's how things went. Paul was named, according to an article I read from Mark Flanagan. He wrote it in 2015. Paul died in 2014. Mark wrote a tribute to him, and he said that Paul was named Whirling Thunder, and he said it was given to him by a Mohawk elder. And according to Flanagan, he said that his son Ed, who was a Native American silversmith, Ed Bullock, who has a shop in Maine, he came with had this great idea of having a Whirling Thunder Memorial Powwow in the Raitt Homestead in Eliot, Maine. So in 2015, in May, they had this great powwow attended by thousands of people from Canada and the United States. Somebody put $1,000 up for an award for a dancing and drumming contest. So that was the tribute they paid, that the kids paid to their dad. Now I skipped the whole, when they moved from the basement to South Main Street. So they moved into the Zito block on South Main Street. At that time, this is an older picture of Paul. Paul ended up being like the master of ceremonies for a lot of these powwows. He was the go-to guy. They would always have him be there and do the calling and telling the stories. Andy and Paul and Harriet moved out of the basement to the Zito block on South Main Street. They started with one storefront and they ended up with 3 storefronts right there in South Main Street. They had a warehouse also. And they also were way ahead of their time. In the 90s, they started online work and became a clearinghouse. They were like the clearinghouse for Native American information in the area. They had workshops, they had schedules of events and powwows, they had materials and books. Chris said they would go to the flea market in Norton when the flea market was around, and they would scour the tables for beads or antique moccasins or antique materials and things. And they would use those and incorporate them in their dancing outfits. So the Wandering Bull stayed in Attleboro for 20 years. Here's Andy again as it expanded. And the article was about the future to sell the past, and they were using online selling. That's a picture of Chris and Paul at an event. Now Chris Bullock, the gentleman on the left, now runs the online version of the Wandering Bull out of his house in New Hampshire, I think since 2009. And it's a great website, The Wandering Bull. Look it up on the computer. They've got some great things there. From the basement to the South Attleboro block, to the South Main Street block. Andy now carrying on his tradition at the Mount Kearsarge Museum, and Chris carrying on the Wandering Bull, and Ed, who is a silversmith, Native American silversmith in Maine, basically living their dad's legacy, really. Let's see. One more thing. So I guess round about 5 years before Paul died, he and his wife decided they'd start writing down their story. And they did. And so Paul would talk and she would write, and lo and behold, they end up writing a story. And the story is called, that's the Wandering Bull website. Andy, Chris and Carolyn, husband and wife, Ed, Betsy Bullock was my first person I talked to. Betsy is a son or a daughter of Paul Bullock, and she told me, go talk to my brothers. They have all the information. And they just gave me basically everything I shared with you tonight. Whirling Thunder, One Man's Journey Through Native America. And that was the book that Paul and Harriet wrote. You can get it through the Little Bull, which is Ed Bullock's jewelry store in York, Maine, I think it is. So if you go to thelittlebowl.com, you can buy it through them. You can buy it through Amazon too. I figure why not buy it through the source. And this is the blurb that went on. It basically summarizes everything I've kind of gotten given you. It talks about how he was a youngster and the kids jumped into the car and they learned dances and songs, and basically that Paul was dedicated to sharing the story of the Wampanoag people. So I kind of went full circle, and here's how I summarize this up. So the Pokanoket, was the name of the tribe before the Wampanoag. And the Pokanoket had a long legacy of artisanship in the Attleboro area, just like Attleboro has had in other industries. It's only fitting to share their tools and the products in the case that we have here in the Attleboro Area Industrial Museum. It was their ability to use the materials they found, the stone, the minerals, the wood, the animal parts, and the animals themselves. And that started the long history and legacy of Attleboro's artisanship and craftsmanship that we have here in the Industrial Museum. An interesting fact I learned was that the Pokanoket was outlawed after the King Philip's War. You could no longer call yourself a Pokanoket. If you did, you'd be put to death. And they changed, the settlers changed the name to Wampanoag, and that law was on the books in Massachusetts until early 2001. So it's interesting how things change, but they say the same. But it was an eye-opener for me to look at how repeating the story was from the Wampanoags, how they had the tools and made the products, and so did the button makers and the textile workers and the jewelry makers and the circuit makers all through Attleboro's industrial history. It was really, it's great. It was tied together really well, and I'm glad you got to hear about it. Go to the websites that I mentioned. Go to the Robbins Museum in Middleborough. It's great. You call ahead. And when I went, they had a lot of different things there that they were showing, and a lot of space. If you're into, anthropology and archaeology, you're going to love it. Thanks. And these are actual artifacts that I use when I do my program with kids. So I go out into the schools when I can. This is a pedestal that they would use to grind their corn. This is an actual axe head, but a replica body. So I think previous director, George Shelton, made that. A couple of projectile tips that the tips have been broken off. And then this is a scraper and made out of soapstone. And when you bring things out, sometimes with school kids, things happen. So this one broke, but they would use it to scrape the hides, as far as I know. Glad you guys came, and check out the real case out there. And if you have any other questions, shoot me an email here at the industrialmuseum.com, director at industrialmuseum.com, and I'll do my best to answer it. Thank you.